In this particular lecture, let's learn what exactly is JSX. So we have already created a component and we have said multiple times that a component actually returns some JSX code. So now let's understand what exactly is JSX. So JSX is a special syntax which stands for JavaScript extension. And JSX allows you to combine HTML with JavaScript. So this code right here is actually an HTML, but what you could also do is you could also include some JavaScript code in there as well. So let's take an example to understand this. So as this is a component, let me create some variable here outside the component. So let's say I say const, let's create a variable called as name, and let's say the name is drop. All right. So a normal HTML tag won't be able to include any kind of JavaScript within itself. However, if you take a look at this code isn't normal JavaScript, but instead this is JSX, and JSX should allow us to add JavaScript code in there. So whenever you have to include some JavaScript code inside your JSX, you make use of curly brackets like that. And inside this curly bracket, you could go ahead and write in any kind of JavaScript code in there. So let's say, for example, if I want to display the contents of the name variable here. So I would type a name here, which is nothing but it refers to this variable right here. And this variable is just a regular normal JavaScript variable. So now let's see what happens if I go back to the home page. So here it says hello from a component and then we have drop. So what JSX did is that it kind of rendered this HTML for us on the web page, and it also evaluated this particular JavaScript code for us as well. So that means you could not simply just write JavaScript variables in there, but you could also go ahead and write JavaScript expressions as well. So let's go ahead and let's try to do that. So instead of name, let's say I want to write a JavaScript expression here. So let's say we want to write a JavaScript mathematical expression. So I could say something like 10 plus 20. And if I save this code, if I go back, as you can see, it has actually evaluated that particular expression for us. So now let's go ahead and let's try to do something more complex. So let's say over here, I create some JavaScript function. So let's say function display message. Let's say this is a function which returns something. So let's make this thing return some message like wow. All right. So now let's call that particular function here and let's see what exactly happens. So I would say display message. Let's call this function here, just as we would call a normal JavaScript function. And if I do that, even that function is going to be evaluated. And as that function returns wow, this wow gets displayed up over here. So this is what exactly JSX is. Now, while talking about JSX, there are a couple of rules of this JSX which you need to understand and which needs to be followed. So one such example is that whenever you are returning some JSX from a component, it should only return a single element. So what exactly do I mean by that? So to understand this, let's take an example. So let me clean up all the code from here. So right now, this component which we have, it's returning one single root element, which is this h1 element. And let's try to see what happens if we add one more element in there. So let's say I create another h1 element, and this time I say, wow. All right, so if you save this, you're going to get an error. And if you actually go ahead, take a look at the error here, it says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. That's because now our component is actually returning two root elements, and that should not be the case. Instead, we should be returning a one single root element, and you could have multiple elements in that single returned root element. So what exactly do I mean by that? So what you could do is, if you want to return two headings, that's absolutely fine. You could just cut this. So cut this and create a single div element. And inside this div element, you could actually have your two h1s like that. Now this won't be a problem. So now if you save this code, go back here. Now we have your two headings displayed up over here. But if you take a look at the root element here, we have a single root element called as div. And that is why whenever you typically create functions, you always return a single div, and whatever other content or other JSX code which you want to return, you could actually have in between those two divs. And as long as you do that and follow that rule, you should have no problem at all. So I hope this kind of gives you an idea about what exactly JSX is and how it could be used. Let's go ahead and discuss about reusability of components. So we have already discussed what exactly a component is, how to create a component, and we have also learned that components are reusable. So let's discuss how exactly components are reusable. So React encourages developers to break down their user interface into multiple smaller UI components, and these are exactly what those components are. So up until this point, we have created one component, which is hello.jsx, and this is what that component currently looks like. Now, the question is, why exactly do you need to break down your React code into such components? Can't you just go ahead and write all of your code into this one single application, which is app.jsx? So the reason why we use components in React is because of these specific reasons. So the first reason for using components in React is the modularity of code. So using components makes your application modular such that you have multiple modules or sections inside of your application. And each component kind of acts like a module and it provides a specific UI functionality. And managing such an application becomes quite easy. So for example, as your application is comprised of multiple modules, you could manage every single of those modules instead of managing that entire application. So for example, if you take a look at this hello component right here, this hello component only does one thing, it does only one job, and you just need to ensure that this hello component does its job well. And therefore, if your application has, let's say, hundreds of components, you just have to manage them individually. The next thing about components, which kind of makes them reusable, is that once you make a component, you could reuse it anywhere in your code. So for example, let's say you create another component like a button. So obviously, if you're building an application, your app might have multiple buttons. So you could simply create one button component inside your components folder, and then you could use that button component as many number of times as you want. So we are going to take an example of that by reusing this hello component. But for now, let's discuss the third aspect why we use components. So the third reason why we use components is testing. Now, as these components are isolated from one another, that means, let's say if one component is not dependent on the other components, they could be tested really well. So you could test each single one of the components one by one, and you could ensure that each of the component works well. And if you could ensure that every single component works well, that means your entire React application is going to work absolutely fine. The next reason why we use components is because of abstraction. And by abstraction, we simply mean hiding away the ugly details of implementation. So let's see this abstraction live. So if you take a look at this app right here, we have used this hello component right here. The hello component actually has this whole bunch of code right here. And even though it's a simple component, it has this much code. Now imagine that you have a complex button component right here, which has a whole bunch of code inside of it. Now, all the complexity of this component is actually hidden by abstraction because in this app file, you just have to go ahead and you just have to call that button component. And this is what the button component simply looks like. So it actually hides away all the complexity. That is how exactly this button is functioning. So all of that is actually abstracted away, and therefore it's highly encouraged that you use components or create multiple components in a React application. All right, so let's take an example of actually reusing a component. So we don't have such complex component at the moment because we have not covered a lot of React concepts. So this will be one of the most simplest examples you'll see of reusing a component. So we already have this component, hello.jsx. So we have already used that up over here as well. So if we go back, this is going to be rendered over here. So to keep things simple, I'll simply go ahead and let's change this component's content to something like hello, and let's add some name like Mike. All right. So now if I go back, it says hello, Mike. That's all fine and good. So let's say I want to say hello multiple times. So in that particular case, in this app.js, I could simply go ahead and call this hello component multiple times. So if I use it 2 times, as you can see, now again, the same component has been reused and I don't have to write any other kind of code here. I could paste it as many number of times as you want. And there we go. What this basically does is it takes the code which is returned by the JSX here and it simply replaces that code over here. So this is how you could reuse a component by simply defining the component once and then using it as many number of times as you want. But now you might have a question in your mind, and that question is, using components this way doesn't make much sense because what's the point in saying hello to Mike 5 times? It doesn't make any sense. This would have made much sense if we could say hello to different people here. So that basically means in our component, instead of saying hello Mike, let's say I want to change the name every time I basically call that particular component. But right now, if you take a look at our component, it is pretty much static. That is, it's always going to say hello Mike and it's not going to say anything else. So now the question is, if the component remains static like that, then what's really the point of using that component or reusing that component? You cannot reuse a component if your component is static. So you need to make it dynamic such that you could change the contents of your component. So in the next lecture, let's go ahead and let's learn how exactly a component could be made a dynamic using props. So let's discuss what exactly are props in the next lecture.